For most of us, endangered species conservation is not a new thing. I remember when I was 5 years old and I used to cry my eyes out about pandas and elephants and other threatened species. Even the already extinct dodo bird used to very much upset me. And it's often mind boggling to imagine something that once existed on our planet ceasing to exist without a trace. Scientifically, extinction is normally considered the moment of the death of the last individual of a species. But what if I were to tell you that the same thing can happen and has happened to the very languages that we speak? We are all familiar with the dead languages from history, like ancient Greek and Latin. But as many linguists will tell you, those languages evolved into new ones through a process called language shift. Just like animals, the more a language is suited to the people who use it, the better chance it has at survival. Ancient Greek and Latin were phased out and replaced by their less formalized counterparts as communication increased and education gaps decreased. According to many linguists, awareness of the plight of endangered languages has become more widespread in recent years, and accounts of the world's language crisis are not uncommon. Unfortunately, language shift can also take a more culturally oppressive form. For example, in this video, we're going to be looking at language families in the United States and the historic oppression and shifting of indigenous languages and cultures in order for a more communicative norm. The linguistic diversity within the United States is divided into 57 different language families. These languages are extremely diverse and reveal a lot about what the human mind can do in terms of grammar. For this video, we're going to be looking at the Condoan language families, which include the following languages presented on the screen. More specifically, we're going to talk about the death of the language Wichita, which evolved from Proto-Northern Caddoan. For some background, let's listen to Cultural Programs Coordinator Gary McAdams talk about the first descriptions of the Wichita language.
The first time the word Wichita appears is around 1719. It was first mentioned, I think, in a journal that I guess it was a Frenchman named La Harpe. He visited a group of Indian tribes around Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that's the first time that that word appears in the history books, I guess you might say.
Linguist Professor David Rood started his Wichita documentation project in 1965 to make up for these kind of weak historical archives. And he did this as part of his doctoral dissertation, but continued this research pretty much throughout his career until his retirement in 2011. He worked primarily with the native speaker Doris Jean Lamar to basically create educational materials through written grammar and audio recordings in order to preserve the language and make it teachable for those who wanted to learn it. Here is a clip of Doris herself introducing herself in the language of Wichita and explaining the predicament.
Doris Jean Lamar, that the city. Here she what that sees, get east not go care. East hatski, Antaria can get east hatsko stuck say, not the akash.
With only one remaining native speaker, the language of Wichita was considered to have very low vitality, meaning that once Doris dies, that means the language will die itself. This is where the work of linguistic typologists come into play. But there is a key distinction between linguistic typology and indigenous revitalization frameworks for their culture and language. One of the key criticisms of linguistic typology in terms of language revitalization is this idea that linguists are only doing this for the purpose of linguistic research itself, as opposed to, revitalization and building linguistic archives that are actually usable. They instead only focus on finding a scientific outcome or research result. What we have now is a discrepancy between linguistic typology, which is answering the question of in what ways do natural languages differ and in what ways are they alike for some kind of cognitive, universal, humanistic conclusion, and indigenous rights frameworks for advocacy, which basically state that languages are endangered due to failures of social justice, like oppression, marginalization, exclusion, deprivation, and so on, all of which take place in the context of imperial, colonial, and nationalist domination. In her master's thesis for the University of Oklahoma, linguist Sapphire Hodges bridges this gap. With the death of Doris Lamar in 2016, she provides 3 still positive outlooks for the future of the Wichita language. The first is that archival materials like those created by David Rood can be enough to revive a language. It's case studies about the Wampanoag where they were able to revive their language through educational materials. And this goes into the second reason, which is there's still a potential use. There are still members of the Wichita tribe who would like to speak their language, but require that archival background in order to actually engage with it since they can't hear it naturally. And finally, the key to this engagement is museums and cultural centers where the culture and the language can exist as one and be preserved universally. So before we condemn Wichita to extinction, I think it is first important to bridge the gap between language documentation and language preservation. And I'll leave you with these last words from Doris herself.
Hiki atske diisha kirikirish atske rakwashtak. Kawakatsi and saka atske natskwashtaki.